In turning to the Great Plains in the late 19th century, the United States had to deal with the Native Americans, who, of course, already occupied the land. To explain how the U.S. did so after the Civil War, we must first go back in time before the Civil War and sort of, grasp the background, the context. That's the purpose of this section of the lecture, to explain how we dealt with the Native Americans going into the late 19th century. To begin with, the U.S. had never treated Native Americans as the Spanish had. Beginning in the 16th century, the 1500s, the Spanish in Central America had largely included Native Americans into their society, albeit as forced to labor. The Spanish had a lot of gold and they needed slaves to mine them. And so there was a lot of close interaction and inclusion in the society. In time, it followed, New Spain had a hierarchical society based on race and including mestizos, those of mixed race. At the top of New Spain society were those of pure Hispanic blood, then came the mestizos, and finally those of pure native blood were at the bottom. In the 17th century, however, the English on the eastern seaboard of North America had largely excluded Native Americans from their society. They demanded their land and treated them as separate nations. Through treaties, soon broken, and through frequent warfare, the English colonies pushed the Native Americans indiscriminately westward, first across the Appalachian Mountains. Relative to New Spain a century before, there was little interbreeding with the Native Americans because, unlike New Spain, there was no gold and thus no shortage of labor for mining. After the United States was created, it largely continued excluding Native Americans, pushing them still westward. This happened in a sad but orderly fashion, of course, with the famous Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Anglo society had encircled several southeastern Indian nations, including the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, and the Creek and Seminole nations, who had, over time, begun to adopt some of the white culture and thus became known to the whites as the, quote, civilized tribes. It appeared that these tribes might actually be included into American society, but the whites wanted their land, and during the presidency of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, the United States forced approximately 100,000 of these Indians to march to a self-designated Indian territory west of the Mississippi, which of course is now Oklahoma. More often, the push westward was not so orderly. As one example, in 1832, a group of Indians had been moved from the Illinois tribal lands westward across the Mississippi to Iowa. They, however, attempted to return. Led by the Sauk Indian Black Hawk, over 1,000 Indians raided Illinois settlements and eventually were pursued and defeated by the U.S. Army. The Black Hawk War gave the young Captain Abraham Lincoln his only military service, although he never saw combat. By the time Black Hawk was defeated, it had killed almost 600 Indians and 70 soldiers and settlers. As Black Hawk fought in Illinois, the Seminole Indians were also fighting their removal from Florida. Outgunned and outnumbered, the Seminole often used guerrilla tactics, and both sides committed real massacres. The war devastated much of the Seminole population in Florida before the nation's defeated remnants finally agreed to go to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. By the end of the Civil War, with the far west settled as we noted earlier, the only area with unconquered Indian peoples was the Great Plains. There lived a number of Indian nations, largely nomadic and living in a culture dominated by buffaloes and horses. Estimates of the total number in the late 19th century are difficult to determine, but many historians place the number as high as 300,000. Most notable was the mighty Sioux nation, who had migrated the plains in the 1700s. The Sioux were a loose confederation of 7 tribes. In the western plains, the Sioux called themselves the Teton people, or the Lakotas, meaning allies. The Sioux and the other the Plain Indians followed the buffalo herds, which could number into the thousands and could be miles long. Historians have estimated that there were over 13 million buffalo on the Great Plains after the Civil War. The Indian nations fought often, especially in the summer. They were polytheistic, believing in a hierarchy of gods that controlled everything. The religions were personal, to establish bonds with the gods through prayer and meditation. As time passed, the Plains Indians were increasingly reliant on trade, especially on items such as pots, kettles, blankets, knives, and guns. A problem for all the Plains Indians was the rapid spread of cholera, typhoid fever, and smallpox, which of course was spread through contact with the whites. It should be added that the famous teepee was perfectly designed for their nomadic life. It was easily disassembled and transformed into a sled to pull supplies. Just after the Civil War ended and the United States was turning its attention to the still unsettled Great Plains, Congress recommended establishing an Indian Peace Commission in its 1867 Report on the Condition of the Indian Tribes. The subsequent Indian Peace Commission recommended specific reservations for the Indians, in a sense, continuing America's historic policy of exclusion. The Indian Peace Commission claimed that the reservation system would make the Indians safer, and with federal aid promised, life would be better for the Native Americans. Many Native Americans agreed. In the Medicine Creek Lodge Treaty of 1867 in Kansas, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne agreed to accept lands in Western Indian Territory, or Oklahoma. The U.S. put them there in part to punish the civilized tribes of Oklahoma who had favored the Confederates in the Civil War. Within years, western Oklahoma became the main reservation for the Southern Plains Indians. The following year, 1868, in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, the Sioux agreed to settle in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. In time, Dakota became the main reservation for the Northern Plains. In general, reservation land was seen as the least attractive to the whites, and the various Indian nations were often forced together or apart without regard to existing tribal claims or disputes. When the promised aid never materialized, it was clear that life on the reservations would not be pleasant. In 1868, Congress established a board of Indian commissioners to reform the problems of the emerging reservation system. The problems remained, however. In 1871, Congress abolished treaty making with all Indian nations and replaced treaties with executive orders by the President. In the following years, both presidential executive orders and the Bureau of Indian Affairs with the Department of Interior, which was created in 1824, guided the reservation system. This concludes the section on the background to the Native Americans on the Great Plains in the late 19th century.